There are all these different ways in which our lives are fundamentally at odds with our nature, and it's making us very ill. The explosion of transgenderism in the developed world, and indeed in the developing world, looks to be linked to increased exposure to harmful chemicals. Sperm counts have been declining precipitously for decades. By 2045, 2050, the median man will have a sperm count of 0. We're moving towards a situation very rapidly where reproduction by natural means may be impossible. You can't just throw money at fertility rates. There's a spiritual problem here. There's something about our society that means that people just don't want to reproduce. There's plenty of evidence that suggests that, mass immigration depresses fertility rates because it has a knock-on effect on every aspect of life. I mean, Enoch Powell was turned into a monster, really, actually, for saying eminently sensible things. I mean, it's been very worrying to see, I think, Nigel Farage drift towards the centre. I don't know whether we're at a tipping point, but it's certainly it's impossible, I think, now to deny the negative effects of mass immigration. Life in Britain is becoming really grim.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of The Sceptic. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Charles Cornish-Dale, also known as the Raw Egg Nationalist, who is an anthropologist, political commentator and men's health writer. He's also the author of several books, the most recent of which is The Last Men, Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity, and that's out later this summer, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Welcome to The Sceptic, Charles.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Laurie.
Yeah, very good to have you here. Let's get into the thesis of this book, really. There's a lot to it, and sort of, tell us what you mean by the last men, I suppose, and all of that, and that fascinating way you introduced the book, sort of talking about the ancient Scythians and the fact that they also had their own reproductive problems and all this. But I suppose my basic question is, well, why is the modern world making us sick?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a very pertinent question. I mean, now is definitely the time to be asking it. You've got a huge health movement, burgeoning health movement, political health movement in the US. So you've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr. leading Health and Human Services with his Make America Healthy Again agenda, which is specifically focused on the question, why are Americans so unhealthy? And Americans are basically the most unhealthy people on the planet. I mean, there are some societies, Polynesian societies, that are fatter, for example, but overall, on balance, Americans are the unhealthiest people in the world. So now is a good time, actually, to be addressing this problem before it gets any bigger and any more unmanageable. But yeah, I mean, my fundamental contention really in all of my work is that not only in The Last Men, but also in the Eggs Benedict option, which was my previous book, and in essays and articles that I write, is that there's a fundamental mismatch between our evolved natures as animals, as humans, and the modern world that we live in. So for modern humans have been around for, let's say, 200,000 years, for argument's sake, right? And we've only been practicing agriculture for 10 to 12,000 years on any kind of scale in certain parts of the world as well, only in certain parts of the world. Industrial societies have only existed for 200 years. Britain was the first industrial society. Industrial revolution begins turn of the 19th century. So we've been living one way for a very, very long time, and then all of a sudden things have changed in an incredible way, and change is accelerating very, very rapidly. And so there's a mismatch really between the way that we've evolved, the creatures we've evolved to be, and the world that we live in. So that's the kind of general outline really of the problem. But then, the specifics are, for example, we're exposed to an enormous burden of toxic chemicals. Especially endocrine disrupting chemicals. These are hormone disrupting chemicals. Many of them mimic the female hormone estrogen in the human body. And this is a totally new thing, and this is actually something that we're only starting to understand. And then you've got things like, we're increasingly sedentary, we eat food, ultra-processed food, which is a totally novel type of food that, has no real parallel in human history. So there are all these different ways in which our lives are fundamentally at odds with our nature, and it's making us very ill. And we come up with superficial answers to these problems. Even things like Ozempic, these new GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs, weight loss drugs, they're a band-aid for the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that we live in this world that is at odds with our nature. So what do we do instead of changing the world, maybe to better, to be sort of more in harmony with our nature? What do? We come up with a new drug that just means that you stop eating, you stop digesting food, and you lose weight. So that would be my kind of broad strokes answer, is that we are a particular kind of organism, and we've now created a type of society that is in so many different ways actually at odds with our nature.
And of course, a key part of that nature being having to reproduce, having to produce the next generation.
Yes.
Of course, the title is The Last Men, and there's these extremely worrying statistics on things like sperm count and the birth rate in general. I mean, tell us a bit about those, and why is that happening?
Yeah, of course. So I mean, it's not hyperbole, the title, The Last Men. I mean, I've called it The Last Men for various different reasons, but one of the fundamental reasons is because actually, if we extrapolate sperm count declines, so sperm counts have been declining precipitously across the Western world, and also, as we're discovering, in the non-Western world as well, in the developing world. New research is showing that. But sperm counts have been declining precipitously for decades. And if you extrapolate the data, by 2045, 2050, the median man will have a sperm count of 0. So what that means basically is that one half of all men will produce no sperm whatsoever, and the other half will produce so few that it doesn't really matter, because you need a certain number of sperm to fertilize an egg. Like the odds are pretty low, even when you have millions of sperm per deciliter of semen. But when you have like 10, it's just not going to happen. So we're moving towards a situation very rapidly where actually reproduction by natural means may be impossible. And this is a mainstream prediction as well. This isn't we're not off in conspiracy land here. These are predictions that are based on existing data by experts, world experts in reproductive health. So there's a lady called Professor Shanna Swan, who's at Mount Sinai Hospital University in New York. She's basically more or less the world's foremost reproductive health expert, and she released a book in 2022 called Countdown, which was specifically about sperm count decline and this, what she calls a spermageddon scenario, which is, it makes it sound funny, spermageddon, it's hard not to laugh when you hear that, but actually it's serious. It's very serious. And it's part and parcel of this broader health problem that we're witnessing. So it's a fundamental mismatch. I think the cause is a fundamental mismatch between our evolved natures and the world that we're living in. It's exposure to harmful chemicals, which are found in plastics and in non-stick coatings and in personal care products, and herbicides and pesticides that are on non-organic food and even on organic food, and in the water supply. It's sedentary lifestyles. It's even things like wearing tight trousers. There have been studies that show that men who wear skinny jeans and tight underpants, have drastically reduced fertility. You mentioned in the introduction actually about the Scythians, the ancient Scythians. One of the things I talk about in the book actually is the fact that more or less every single society faces some kind of reproductive problem. This isn't a new thing that we face reproductive problems. So if you look at the ancient world, you look at ancient Sparta, for example, the Spartans had reproductive problems, and the reproductive problems were basically a result of the kind of militaristic society that Sparta was. Sparta was a slave society with a very narrow aristocratic warrior elite. And so warriors were always at a premium, and Sparta was very often at war. And so you have, these elite soldiers, they're hard to replace. It's actually hard to get women to have enough enough children to replace the warriors being killed in war. You've got this constant churn rate of people being killed. So that was a problem, that ancient Sparta faced. But then you had the ancient Scythians, who were nomadic pastoralists on the Eurasian steppe. They lived on horseback, herded animals, and fought from horseback with bows like the Plains Indians. And they had reproductive problems because they wore tight trousers and because they were in the saddle all day. And that, sitting in general is for long periods of time is very bad for male reproductive health because the testes overheat. And wearing tight trousers is bad. So, all sorts of different societies throughout history have had different reproductive problems. Like it's not a new thing, but I think the scale of our problems today, and also the causes actually, because we're talking about particularly these harmful industrial chemicals that didn't exist until the last century. I mean the first truly synthetic plastic, Bakelite, I think that was invented in 1907, I think. So plastics have been around for about 100 years. And really, it's only since the 1950s that plastics have really been adopted in a huge way. And now, we're churning out billions of tons of plastic a year, and it's really becoming, a kind of essential part of our society. It's, we live in a plastic world now, and the world functions on plastic, needs plastic, and so we're in a bit of a dilemma. But yes, I mean, I think reproductive issues are something that all human societies face, but the scale of this problem, that's what's because it's an existential problem, like I say, spermageddon, and also it's affecting women as well. So it's not just, the headline grabbing statistic is about the sperm counts, but women are suffering equally precipitous declines in all sorts of indexes of fertility as well. I mean, there was a study that was done out of Singapore, for example, that showed that women with higher levels of PFAS chemicals in their blood. So PFAS are non-stick coatings, basically like Teflon. Women with higher levels of PFAS in their blood have a 40% reduced likelihood of bringing a baby to a live baby to full term. I mean, that's pretty serious. So. Both sexes are in this problem together, and that's something also that I try to say in my work is, we can talk about, The End of Men, which was a Tucker Carlson documentary that I was in about these, fertility problems, but actually The End of Men is the end of women as well. So it really is a problem, I think, that unites both sexes and indeed should unite basically our civilization, and trying to find some sort of answer to these problems. But at the moment, at least, it just seems to be really America now, with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in charge of health over there, that's taking these problems seriously. But I'm hoping it will catch on.
And I think one of the things that's interesting here is that, of course, as you've been talking about there, these are problems that are basically material, the problems with too many chemicals from modern industrial society. And yet at the same time, of course, the title of your book the subtitle is Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity. And this is connected to other ideas about sort of spirit and politics and sort of how we view men more philosophically. How would you sort of connect the two, those sort of seemingly quite different material causes and more spiritual ones? I think it's wrong just to approach the fertility problem from the angle of material causes. So in March, I was in Austin, Texas, at the Natal Conference. And this is a conference that's, it was the second Natal Conference. I was at the first one remotely because I was still an anonymous poster at that time, so I appeared by Skype, but I didn't show my face. But this is a conference, a now annual conference, that's being organised by this Mormon group who are very interested in birth rates. I mean, religious minorities like the Amish and the Mormons are actually very good at having children. They're very good at having large families and sort of promoting families and reproduction, which is interesting in and of itself, of course, because the spiritual element is foregrounded there. These are Christian groups. They have a Christian sense of purpose. But anyway, I was at this Natal Conference, and there were lots of people talking
I mean, the central problem is, how do we get birth rates up? That's why the conference is organised. And, there are a lot of people there, economists and people who crunch data and look at spending and correlations between immigration and birth rates and all that kind of stuff. People focusing on material causes. And I was kind of one of a few flies in that ointment. I was there to present a kind of slightly different argument. And I said, look at what Viktor Orban has done in Hungary. Orban, is the poster child of pronatalism in the West, right? He's the only leader in the Western world who has said, I want to preserve my nation, I want to preserve Hungary, and in order to do that, we have to stop relying on mass immigration to keep the birth rate up. So what do you do then to get the birth rate up? Well, you try to encourage people to have children with financial incentives and tax breaks. And that's what he's done, and throughout the Western world, people looking to wean Western nations off mass immigration have looked to Hungary as an example. And I think he started doing that in about 2017. I think that was when the first pronatal measures were brought in, tax breaks for married couples. And, there's this kind of attention-grabbing policy, I think, where if a woman has 4 children, she never pays tax again in her life. But what's happened? Well, actually, nothing. I mean, the birth rate has gone up a little bit, but it's nowhere near replacement rate. And it's still amongst the lowest in Europe. And in fact, actually, if you look at it, it's in that part of Eastern Europe, the Balkans and Eastern Europe, then all of the nations in that area were very heavily affected by the financial crisis in 2008. So actually what it looks like, it could be just recovery after 2008, because other nations in Eastern Europe have also seen a slight upward trend. So there's no reason to believe actually that just throwing money at young people and saying reproduce works. So I made this point in my speech, and I said, look, I think there is a fundamental, there's a spiritual problem here. There's something about our society that is that means that people just don't want to reproduce. And I quoted this quite famous passage from Bronze Age Mindset by Bronze Age Pervert, where he talks about a chimp in state of nature and why chimps in a state of nature out there in the wild don't masturbate. Right, and it's only chimps in zoos that kind of descend into a kind of onanism where they're just constantly, just jerking off, basically. And it's got something to do fundamentally with I think this sense that actually maybe the modern world is a prison. That's sort of what I'm driving at in certain respects, is that actually there's something about existence in the modern world. There's something about liberal democracy, that actually we no longer have high aspirations. We no longer have a deeper sense of purpose. We no longer have outlets to express fundamental human urges. And that means that we don't want to reproduce. And so I framed the book actually in terms of Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. So and that's where I get The Last Men from, but Fukuyama gets it from Nietzsche. So Francis Fukuyama, is taken as the kind of apotheosis of kind of liberal hubris. He comes up with this thesis, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, and he says, okay, this is it. This is the end of history with a capital H, right? And people, especially people who haven't actually read the book, seem to think, he's just saying okay, this is the end of history. Everything's going to be great from here. Nothing's ever going to get better. But that isn't exactly what he was saying. What he's saying is that the sort of politics has evolved. Politics has taken a final form. The victory of liberal democracy over communism, there aren't really any viable alternatives. It's hard to see that there could be a more advanced political system than that. But actually, the second half of the book that Fukuyama wrote is called it's the end of history and the last man, and that's the part of the title of the book that people forget, or if they haven't even read it, that they're sort of not even aware of. But actually, the final quarter of Fukuyama's book, he says, okay, yeah, we've got to this point where it's hard to see there being any further political evolution of any kind of like political form. But actually, this is a hollow victory, because what we've ended up with is a political system, liberal democracy, which allows people to be equal, but it doesn't allow anybody to be better. And he talks about the evolution of political systems in terms of thymos, which is this Greek term. I mean, the Greeks had a very, very penetrating, I think, understanding of psychology and motivation. They might not use terms that we use today, but actually you can recognize exactly what they're talking about. And thymos is this term that basically means something like spiritedness. It's what drives man to do stuff. And Fukuyama reframes it as desire for recognition. That's what he calls thymos. And he says, there are different kinds of desire for recognition. So there's isothymia, which is the desire to be recognized as equal. And that's something that people have, to be, you're one among many, you all have the same rights. That's a desire, a fundamental desire that liberal democracy can satisfy, because we all have fundamental rights. We are all equal before the law. We all have equal political status. We all have equal opportunities, or think we do, and it goes hand in hand with the kind of blank slatism that's associated, with kind of modern democratic thinking, where we like to tell ourselves that we're all equipped in the same way, to go out into the world and have equal success or failure. But then there's this other kind of thymos called megalothymia, which is a desire to be better. And liberal democracy just doesn't offer any satisfying outlets for megalothymia. So the ideal citizen, in a sense, is just a consumer. It's just someone who is like a passive recipient of culture, equal with everyone else. You go out and you buy stuff and you work a job, and that's supposed to be satisfying, that kind of existence. But actually there's something in men in particular that drives them to want more, megalothymia. And that's what's not satisfied by liberal democracy. And Fukuyama himself says this, and Fukuyama asks, well, what's going to happen then? If liberal democracy is all that's left, what's going to happen? Maybe some people are going to rebel against the kind of ascendancy, the dominance of liberal democracy. Fukuyama actually says, what we will probably see in the future is immense wars of the spirit. He actually says, groups of men will revolt against liberal democracy because it is so unsatisfying from a spiritual level. And I think he's actually been vindicated in that. If you look, for instance, and I talk about this in the book, if you look at the Middle East, and I talked about this at NatalCon as well, if you look at the Middle East, if you look at the rejection of liberal democracy in the Middle East, if you look at groups like Al-Qaeda and especially ISIS, the ISIS Caliphate, that kind of bloody orgy of rape and murder, that is a fundamental rejection of the Western way of life. It's not saying that it has sort of merits on those terms. I'm not a sympathizer with ISIS, obviously, but you can see that it is a kind of spiritual revolt. And so that's kind of that's the kind of broader philosophical framing of the book, is that actually, we've got these material problems that we can recognize, and we can talk about birth rates and obesity and all these other things. But actually there's this sits on, above it or around it, there is this kind of spiritual problem as well, that it's actually that even if we solve the material problems, even if, say, we, cleaned up the environment and got rid of all endocrine disrupting chemicals and encouraged people to exercise, we would still live in a liberal democracy, and it would still in many ways be spiritually stifling for a lot of men. And so, what do you do? Is there a solution to that? And it's actually an open-ended question in the book. But it's a question that's occupied a lot of great thinkers, Fukuyama, Nietzsche, William James, for example. So in the postscript to the book, I talk about this famous essay William James, brother of Henry James, the novelist, wrote in 1910 called The Moral Equivalent of War, where it's framed slightly differently, but he says, I'm a pacifist, I'm a socialist, I don't like war. and I don't want there to be war. War is too destructive now. War kills too many people. It has it causes so much damage. But nevertheless, war is kind of like the mother of all virtue. War is the mother of, courage and bravery and the ability of individuals to subordinate themselves to the group in service of a higher goal. And all of these beneficial things that have created Western civilization and driven it to greatness. And so if you get rid of war, how do you make men? How do you instill those virtues in men? And it's a serious question. It's like if
hard times create strong men.
It's the meme. But if life is just Netflix and Deliveroo, what kind of people do you create in that sort of world? And it's a difficult question. Well, it's actually not a difficult question to answer, because I think we all know what kind of person it creates. But it's unsettling. It's unsettling, I think. And I wanted the book to be provocative. I didn't want to answer all of the questions. Because I think that they're it's actually better to kind of provoke people to think. And so that's the broad framing, is that there is actually a spiritual crisis too, and that actually we're probably not going to get very far if we don't address that as well.
I would say that it's interesting. If you think about that, both of those problems in a way are coming from sort of consumerism and mass industry, and that on the one hand it's creating a society in which your only role is to be a consumer and simply just to have satisfy these desires, watch Netflix and whatever else, and get fat. Which is on the one hand destroying the spirit, but at the same time it's actually the chemicals, the microplastics. We could talk about more of them that have been also necessary to create that amount of sort of capitalist enterprise and production and everything else. And it's almost as if it's, in a way, the same cause there, but with two sort of different, one spiritual effect, one material.
Well, what I actually do in the book is I say, look, thymos, this idea of spiritedness, that's actually a good proxy for testosterone, the master male hormone. All of the things that we associate, or very many of the things that we associate with thymos. So Plato, I think, in the Republic says, thymos makes a man defend his polis, the city, like a wild dog. It sort of animates man, and makes him sort of virtuous and powerful and brave and all these kind of things. But actually, all of the or very many of the things that we associate with thymos, spiritedness, a desire to assert oneself, to achieve, motivation, those are things that actually testosterone does. And so the decline of thymos on a civilizational level also tracks with the decline of testosterone. And we can talk about plummeting sperm counts. Well, we've also got plummeting testosterone levels as well. It's a broader reproductive health crisis. If men's testes aren't producing enough sperm, if they're not functioning properly, they're also likely not to be producing enough testosterone as well. And that is actually the case. Sperm counts and testosterone levels have plummeted in tandem. So we're seeing what looks to be a 1% year-on-year decrease in testosterone levels across the Western world. So within 25 years, within less than a generation, testosterone levels will fall a quarter. It is apocalyptic. It is apocalyptic, and you only need to look around you, I think, to see the effects of that. There's a big literature on the sort of crisis of masculinity, and that's become a big it's become a big thing. You've got people like Jordan Peterson, who he's become a superstar off the back of counselling young men and trying to get them to take control of their lives again. And part of the reason there are so many aimless young men is because testosterone levels have decreased so precipitously. And, you have a phenomenon like the hikikomori in Japan, which I talk about in the book. These are extreme social recluses. They're mostly men. There are millions and millions of men in Japan who just hide away. They live at home with their parents. They don't do anything. They just play video games. They eat fast food. They don't have any contact with anybody whatsoever. Well, there have been studies that show that if you have low testosterone, in a specifically Japanese context, men with low testosterone are more likely to become extreme social recluses. Because testosterone is what motivates men and what drives men and gives them libido and energy and muscle mass and all of these things that we associate with being traditionally masculine. So it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, and it's a problem you can measure as well. So that's one of the reasons why I think actually using testosterone as a proxy or even as a measure is good, because actually you can quantify it. You can say, look, there are these gold standard studies, and the book is very scientifically grounded. There's a lot of scientific studies in there, because I think it's important, because otherwise you get people just saying, oh, well, you're making this is a conspiracy, this is Alex Jones stuff, whatever, right? But actually, no, it's very well quantified. So you have, for example, the Massachusetts male aging study, which is a study that I lean quite heavily on. Was really the first to establish that there is a civilizational decline, a generational civilizational decline in testosterone levels, and it's an amazingly well done study. It's like gold standard, random sample from a population in Massachusetts, and it showed that, yes, 1% year-on-year decline in testosterone levels, and those results have been replicated in other studies, Finland, Israel, other studies in the US, and now outside the US, as outside the developed world as well. So it's real. It is real, and I've tried to impress that as much as possible in the book through using science, because of course science has the ultimate authority as a form of knowledge. So it's you've got the philosophy, but you've also got science as well, hard science backing it up.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that concept of thymos and testosterone, I think, is very important here. And of course, as a way of really marrying up body and soul, if you like. And of course, someone like Plato would very well have understood that you are not just a set of thoughts and ideas. You are, so the soul and the spirit. You are also a body, and those go together. And that's also very well built into the Christian tradition as well. But of course, a modern understanding of the self kind of gets away from that, and sort of suddenly you really just your thoughts and the body is sort of incidental. Sometimes referred to as Gnostic almost. I suppose that's one reason we sort of struggle to understand it, and we want to point only to material causes or only to spiritual ones, but actually really they're very related. They're
inseparable. So yes, I think this mind-body dualism that we have is at the root of a lot of fundamental misunderstandings in Western thought and in popular thought about these kinds of problems. We can trace it back as far as we want to. You could talk about Descartes, and you could talk about the Christian idea of the soul, the kind of immortality of the soul, and that it's separate from the body and all this kind of stuff. But you look back at the ancients, and no, they thought, mind and body are inseparable. Mens sana in corpore sano, healthy mind and healthy body. That was basic. That was a basic understanding for them. But we've forgotten that, and it's news to people when you say, for example, when there's a study that shows something like school kids do better if they do exercise. Like if you have more exercise, if school kids eat better and there's more exercise, like they do an hour of exercise a day at school, their grades go up. They do better. Because like bodily function is mental function, and being sedentary, and you can give materialist explanations for it as well. You can say, it's because it increases blood flow to the brain, for example, or it switches on metabolic processes that cause, the development of more white tissue in the brain or something, or whatever. But fundamentally, actually, it's both materialist and it's physicalist and kind of spiritualist at the same time. It's mind and and matter at the same time. But yes, I mean, reminding people that actually, you are an integrated whole, and that your mind and your body work together, or they fall apart together, is one of the fundamental things that I try to do, and it definitely runs right through this book. In connecting the kind of spiritual nature of the crisis and the material nature of it as well.
Absolutely. And there's a specific example of that, of course, in transgenderism. And so, I mean, the typical way that is explained sort of by the right and, by people critical of it is to say, well, there have been these ideologies which tell you that you can become a woman, and sort of it's a cult, and so maybe it's the modern spirits, becoming too obsessed with itself and too extreme, and sort of thinking you can just throw off all of these things, and fair enough, there is certainly an ideology behind it,
there is
identity politics as well. But as you point out, actually, there's also some quite significant material causes in here as well. I mean, just tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, of course. So yes, I mean, there are obviously ideological and social aspects to transgenderism, and it's well substantiated in the literature as well. So there are, studies in journals like PLOS One of transgenderism as a social contagion. Like other forms of social contagion that we've seen in the past, I mean, you have outbreaks of things like bulimia and self-harm. I mean, you can show that these things are passed around in social groups. For example, like if you're in a social group with somebody who already has gender dysphoria, you are as a child, or a teenager, you're at a much higher risk or likelihood of then saying that you have gender dysphoria yourself. So there absolutely is a kind of social and ideological element to it, but there's also a kind of base material element to it, a biological element to it. So one of the chapters of the book is a commentary on and a reassessment of the gay frogs controversy. When Alex Jones famously, I think it was 2015, said, I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the frickin' frogs gay. And he was ridiculed. It became a meme, and people were... I mean, he didn't help himself by dressing up as a gay frog. Obviously, but he put on a frog costume and a pink tutu and was pretending to be a gay frog, sipping a bottle of herbicide.
Look at me, I'm a gay frog. I'm so cool. I'm so neat. I'll never have children, and I'm sterilized.
But Alex Jones was talking about studies that had been done on frogs. So there's a researcher in the US called Tyrone Hayes, and he exposed African clawed frog larvae to the herbicide atrazine, which is, I think it's the second most used herbicide in the US, apart from glyphosate. It's sprayed everywhere. It's sprayed in enormous quantities on farm produce, but it's also used on lawns and in gardens. And it's an endocrine disruptor. It interferes with hormonal function, sexual development. He was able to show, Tyrone Hayes, in a series of experiments, that if you expose male African clawed frog larvae to atrazine in a laboratory, a significant number of them will actually develop into female frogs that can then successfully mate with male frogs and have viable offspring. So you can make these frog larvae change their gender, male to female, which raises obvious questions about the effects of atrazine and other endocrine disrupting chemicals on human fertility and reproductive development. And that was so he did those experiments around about sort of 2010, 2011, right? And it was mainstream. It was covered in National Geographic. It was covered in Science magazine. It wasn't treated as a conspiracy. It was treated as what it was, which was legitimate scientific research. And there's huge amounts of scientific research about endocrine disruptors. So their effects on fertility and health and hormonal function and association with particular kinds of cancers and all this kind of stuff is very well substantiated. It's not in any sense a conspiracy. But when Alex Jones got a hold of it 4 years after the study had been published, it became associated with conspiracy theories, and it became a ridiculous, notion that actually common chemicals that Americans and people in other parts of the world are exposed to on a daily basis could be having gender bending effects, right? So I talk about the gay frogs controversy and about endocrine disruptors, and I say, look, like all of this is actually very plausible. Everything that Alex Jones was saying was totally plausible, backed up by science, backed up by what we know about sexual development, how it actually works, on the basis of hormones, and the fact that if you interfere with the ratios of particularly testosterone to estrogen at key points in human development from conception, so including in the womb, you can have all sorts of terrible effects from, like genital malformation to, like reproductive, reduced fertility, reduced testosterone levels, rare forms of cancer, uterine cancer, testicular cancer. So that's all on paper. We not only on paper, it's also substantiated, but on paper, the idea that these chemicals could be causing transgenderism in humans and not just animals. I mean, that's prima facie. There's a good case for that. Well, there was a study as well. So there's a recent study, and I talk about this in the book, that shows a very clear link between exposure to an endocrine disrupting chemical during gestation, so in the womb, and massively elevated rates of transgenderism. So I think it's, as far as I can tell, it is the first study that's ever really actually substantiated this. So it's a study of this synthetic form of estrogen called diethylstilbestrol, and it was given from the 1950s to I think the 1970s to pregnant women who had a history of miscarriages, and it was given to them supposedly, to prevent them from having a miscarriage. But actually what it did was it led to all sorts of horrible birth defects, and it was discontinued, rare cancers, all this kind of stuff. But this new study, which is a study, I think, of boys in France, shows that boys whose mothers were given diethylstilbestrol while they were in the womb have a massively elevated risk of being transgender. So there's now a clear correlation, which is obviously a causal suggestion, that actually exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals could definitely be responsible for increased incidence of transgenderism. And I say, look, like, okay, now there's no way you cannot say that this is a conspiracy theory now. You just can't. Like, you have to answer this actual empirical study that shows it's not just Alex Jones saying it. It's actually like, okay, the explosion of transgenderism in the developed world, and indeed in the developing world, gender dysphoria looks to be linked to increased exposure to harmful chemicals, to toxic industrial chemicals, and to other kinds of chemicals as well. So yes, I mean, that's kind of reclaiming the gay frogs conspiracy theory and actually saying it's not a conspiracy theory at all, and it wasn't a conspiracy theory at the time either. But unfortunately, this is just what the liberal media does. They take something, they take it out of context, they strip it of context, they present it to the public as like a cudgel to bash someone over the head, and 10 years later, we could have spent 10 years actually talking purposefully about this. We could have spent 10 years doing purposeful research and actually trying to address it. But no, it's taken 10 years for us to come back round actually to the position we were in 2011 when this chap Tyrone Hayes published these studies, which is actually, harmful chemicals, common chemicals have gender bending effects, and we don't fully understand just what they're doing, and we should find out what they're doing. We really should. But transgenderism is such a toxic issue. It's probably the most toxic issue, I think. As soon as you start to talk about it, you're attacked. I mean, look at J.K. Rowling. Look at what it's done to her legacy and her reputation. But I say in the book, like, I think it's it's a compassionate thing, actually, to want to do something about this. Like being born, because this is a biological problem. That's what I'm saying. It's not just a problem of ideology. It is actually something that is being forced on people biologically, because we've created this horribly toxic world, and in the womb, fetuses are exposed to harmful chemicals that alter their hormonal balance and prevent their genitalia from developing and their brains from developing properly. So we should want to spare people this. It's not saying transgender people shouldn't exist, they don't have a right to exist or anything. It's like saying, actually, look, this is an avoidable harm. And I think it is. But again, it's very hard to have a sane discussion about it, unfortunately.
Yes, and it would actually be the compassionate thing to do, to be able to get to grips with this, right?
No.
But we can't. Okay, well, so let's. I'm keen to get into some other political topics in a second, but I suppose before we do, obviously, you've diagnosed a lot of these problems that the modern world is giving us with our health. What are some of the ways we can try to address them?
So one of the fundamental things, one of the sort of discouraging, worrying facts is that you can't get away from the toxicity of the modern world, and microplastics, which I talk about at length in the book, and I also talk about a lot on Twitter and on my Substack and in various other places. Microplastics are everywhere, right? So, they find microplastics in snow, on mountains that humans have never set foot in. They're at the bottom of the ocean. They're circulating in the air. They're in household dust. So we can't totally we can't insulate ourselves from the toxicity of the modern world, but what we can do is we can reduce our exposure to it, and that is the best thing.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.